part of our AI webinar series, and this is the second one. We had our first one last month, looking at data annotators and workers within the AI ecosystem. An introduction to today's discussion. As artificial intelligence continues to shape the global innovation ecosystem, the demand for high-quality, diverse, and representative data sets has become increasingly pronounced. Within this landscape, Africa's cultural, linguistic, and socio-economic diversity offers opportunities to inform and enrich AI development. I can frame us on what the session will seek to do, and that is to examine how intellectual property frameworks, data licensing mechanisms can be designed to safeguard African data sets while promoting equitable participation in global AI research and innovation. Our discussion today will also explore emerging models such as the Nolite Obodo Open Data License, in short, NOODLE, that was developed to address the unique challenges of African language data sets, on how they will be used and sharing them within the African context. And with that framing, it is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, who will again just bring a wealth of their experience and knowledge to our discussions today. So first we have Dr. Melissa Omino. Dr. Melissa Omino is the director of the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at Strathmore University, the leading East African AI policy hub and data governance policy center. Her research direction is focused on utilizing an African lens and a human rights lens. Part of the research conducted under Dr. Omino's leadership at CIPIT involved mapping AI applications in Africa as the initial step in answering the question, what determines African AI and the problems it aims to solve in Africa. Dr. Omino is an intellectual property expert and has served as an advisory board member in several projects that intersect between AI and IP, including the National AI Strategy Process and leading IP advisory to global entity funding AI research in Africa. Two, we have Dr. Betsy Mureithi. Dr. Betsy Mureithi is a research fellow at iLab Africa, where she leverages her expertise in data analytics to address pressing societal challenges. Her research interests include exploring how emerging technologies can be used to create practical solutions for communities and businesses. She has developed tools that integrate AI and IoT to support smallholder farmers in enhancing climate resilience and productivity, as well as decision support systems that improve public health performance monitoring. She also studies human-computer interaction, focusing on the mechanisms that enable effective data use for decision-making, and that is whether it's helping farmers optimize agricultural practices or assisting healthcare managers in boosting facility efficiency, and two, how AI and data systems can be designed to be more inclusive, fostering equitable access to technology in communities and businesses. Three, we have Ms. Jobet Koros. Ms. Jobet Koros is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and holds a master's in intellectual property law. She leads research on the intersection of IP law and innovation at CIPIT. Her work seeks to shape IP law and policy in Kenya, advance regional reform efforts across Africa, and contribute to global discussions on the evolving IP landscape. Her current research focuses on Kenya's copyright law in the context of emerging technologies, copyright reform processes across Africa, and ongoing international negotiations, particularly on balancing exclusive rights with public interest objectives through effective limitations and exceptions. In addition to her research, Ms. Schubert is dedicated in advancing IP education and capacity building. She designs and facilitates training programs in IP law, with recent sessions addressing the emerging challenges and opportunities at the intersection of artificial intelligence and intellectual property. Fourth, we have Ms. Florence Ogonjo. She is a tech policy researcher, advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and a research fellow for the AI Policy Center here at CIPIT. She is also pursuing a master's in public policy at Strathmore University, and her research on AI governance, her research focuses on AI governance, ethical AI, data protection policy, and digital rights, with a broader interest in the intersection of technology, law, and human rights. She explores the regulatory and policy frameworks needed to ensure responsible AI development, data governance, and the protection of fundamental rights in the digital age. Through her work, Ms. Florence seeks to bridge the gap between emerging technologies and legal frameworks, advocating for policies that promote innovation while safeguarding human rights. Welcome to our panelists. And as you've heard, they really do know, they really will, again, edify our discussions today. So with that introduction, I'd like to open the floor with this first question to our panelists today. And the question is, why are African datasets so central to the development of ethical and inclusive African AI systems? And in your opinion, what key challenges do you see around their ownership, access, and control today? I'd like to start with Dr. Betsy Mureithi.
Right. Thank you, Cynthia. To start with, I can give an example. So I think it was last week. I was at a workshop on what are the possibilities and the challenges, and there was a lot of AI tools and models that are aligned with Africa, our context, whether it's our behavior, our norms, upholding our values. And so in the room, there are a lot of bankers and experts across the Kenyan financial ecosystem. But the key question I pose to them is, while there is that need to be able to develop AI tools and systems that speak to us, basically. But the challenge is, where is the data that you're contributing to build these models, right? So there's one thing to say that we need models that are tuned to us, but there's another thing to now say, okay, wait, put your money where your mouth is and give us these models. So ABSA, for example, was there, and I haven't seen them release a financial research data set for credit scoring African MSMEs, for example. And then as an example of what is possible based on this workshop that I attended, there's a company called Freddie Mac in the US, which is a mortgaging company. They've been maintaining the single family loan level data set since 1999, and it contains quarterly snapshots of mortgage loans in the US and loan repayment behavior, and it's updated every 3 months. So between 1999 and 2002, there are about 50 million records on mortgage loans. So I think a lot of, and I'll expound this as we go along, there's a lot of people hiding behind, licensing and data protection acts, and not sharing the data that already exists. And so we need to at least expound on licensing. So how can we have open data sets that can still be financially sustainable? So just because it's open doesn't mean it's free. How can you ensure that control is within the African data landscape, so it's not being exported outside and it's serving our purposes as Africans? So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Betsy. Dr. Melissa?
Thank you. I think for me, the question really is about what do we mean by inclusive African AI systems, what are they meant to do, and how then African data sets come into that space. So for me, inclusivity and ethical considerations around AI systems is really about what they're supposed to do, right? For at CIPIT, we define African AI as AI that solves African problems, right? Because for us, AI is a tool. So essentially, in solving problems, you must go about it in an ethical and inclusive way. So African datasets essentially allow you to be able to solve African problems more efficiently and effectively because they have the context of the population that you want to solve problems for. So that's why they are central. You can't use data sets from outside Africa to try and solve African problems. And I'm being very specific here because I think there are generalized problems that can be solved on a global level, right? So if we think about some health applications make sense across the globe because the human body is the human body, but there can be nuances based on geography and genetics, right? So that's why you would need African, for example, data sets for a particular area to make sense of solving that particular problem. So essentially, they make sure that the AI tool works for the African ecosystem. Now, when we talk about access, control, ownership, that's another very heavy conversation because how do we then get to have African data sets? Do they just appear from nowhere? Or what is the process of gathering or collecting African data? Who is involved in the collection of African data? Where are they collecting it from? And from that tells us who then has access and who then controls. So essentially, those who fund the activity of data collection decide many of these parameters of control and access, as well as ownership. A lot of them, however, have been moving towards an open access, open data model, or they purport to move towards that. But I do think that there's open washing that is happening as well. What does that mean? Where you are prescribing for people what type of open license that they need to utilize for a particular data set. And if you do prescribe for people what sort of license that they use for a particular data set, is that truly espousing the principles of being open? Because you're then not removing the element of choice as to how access and control is determined. So yeah, that would be my answer for that first question. And I can see Cynthia is no longer host. So maybe Chabet, you can pick up from there.
Thank you very much. I think we're having a bit of an internet issue, but nonetheless, I'll answer the same question, and much of my answer is a bit similar to what Dr. Melissa has said. So for me, why I think it's important is because, one, we have to think about our realities. They're very different from other contextual countries or other countries that you might consider. And so we have to think about our realities. That's one thing why it's central. And also because we have a very complex ecosystem. So when you're looking about African data that will come up with African AI systems, think about the different people who are going to be involved. So we have linguists, we have journalists, storytellers, we have those who want to archive our culture and all that. And so we have to think about, okay, we have to have a collaboration that is cross-cutting in all these things, which we ensure that the communities have to consider the different languages, cultures, and identities that are around that. Then also, because fairness and representation matters, if we consider having data sets which are largely from the global outlook or from the northern perspective, then we have the risk of coming up with AI tools which do not really translate well for us. Excuse me. So you'll have a situation where there is mistranslation of, say, even a Swahili model that has been wrongly taken. And so the nuances around that don't really come out. So why I think it's central is, for me, just four things. One is we have to consider our realities. That's why it's central. Also, fairness and representation matters. And then also the complex ecosystem that I've talked about. And lastly, because we need to ensure that we're not misrepresenting or even erasing our African context. And I think I'll stop there for now and hand it over to Florence also to answer the same question. Thank you.
If you're speaking, we can't hear you. I don't know if that's just me.
Hear me
Yes,
now?
we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So good afternoon to everyone once again. Chebet, thank you for throwing the question to my end. Not sure that there is much that I would add in terms of answering the similar question, seeing as a big chunk of what I will say will be a slight repetition of what has already been said. But just to add, I think one of the, and to pull out from one of the events we had last week on the Data Research Day. So one of the key things that came up consistently from the conversations that we were having was how African data, or rather cultural data, is represented with respect to AI. And one of the key questions that was asked is whether having African data sets is more or less just a representation issue, or it's bigger than it being a representation issue, which brings us back to looking at why they have become so central to development. One of the key areas in which we champion having African data sets has been in terms of representation, and then having elements of those who would be able to access certain AI technologies that have been created using African data sets. Which takes us back to the question that Dr. Melissa had asked. If we are having all these African data sets being developed and having them being central to how AI is evolving, not just within the continent, but also globally, how sure are we that aside from representation, that the people within the continent are actually going to be able to use these technologies? Do they actually have access to be able to use some of these technologies that are being built based on African? If that is the case, it brings us to a question of not just access, but also ownership. And when it comes to ownership, it's who owns the ultimate African data sets? How are we collecting the data that we are going to be using for creating these data sets? Is it the particular communities? And if it's the particular communities, do we have a way in which there's certain benefits that are going to go back to them, especially if there's going to be profit margins from the AI systems that are being developed? So in thinking about it within that particular context as well, looking at it in terms of control. So we find that most of the African data sets that are actually out there are always prescribed under open data sets. They're always open. And as Betsy said, just because it's open doesn't mean it's not free. So in as much as it's open and we're looking at it from the context of representation as well as ownership, which then brings us to elements of access. Can we be able to compound the entire conversation in holistically looking at it and ensuring that the importance of having African AI data sets is not just an issue of representation, but goes beyond that? And how can we also be able to think about it in terms of a policy conversation coming up in terms of protection of such data sets, which speaks to licensing and other policy parameters that can be developed within that context? So thank you.
Thank you so much, to our panelists. And I think the thing that is coming out again is a question of who owns, which then now informs the access and the control question. And to you, Chebet, then now I ask, what role do intellectual property laws play in defining ownership, access, and control of African assets?
Thank you for that question, Cynthia. To start first, I think one of the biggest challenges we are finding is a balance between openness, ownership, access, and control. When you have open data initiatives, you have to have collaboration and innovation, because often we have a collision between the legal and ethical imperatives. Now, when we're talking about intellectual property in this context, mostly we'll talk about copyright. And copyright is, so intellectual property is the protection for creations of your mind. Copyright will protect the literary and artistic works that you have. In this context, we have datasets. So in the Kenyan copyright law and in many other African copyright laws, we have the protection of copyright for compilations of data. Now, when you have this right, it means that you have the right to control the use, the reuse, the distribution, the translation, the adaptation of this right. And only the owner or the author of this would have that right to control. However, you can now give that right to somebody else using a license. And then here you'd be able to decide, okay, to what element, to what extent you're allowed to use this. So IP laws, especially copyright, play a vital role in this context, and they determine who owns the data, who can use it, and on what terms they can use it. But ultimately shapes whether AI innovation is inclusive or exclusionary. At the beginning of this webinar, we had a video which told us about an example we encountered at CIPIT. This was an example where there's a project called the Masakane project, where a community-driven initiative focused on applying machine learning and NLP, or natural language processing, to African languages. So this team used the JW300 dataset, which is a compilation of 300 languages, which they've collected as Bible translations. Because it was aligned in chapter and verse, it was very easy for the machine translation experiments to occur. But when the dataset was reviewed by CIPIT, it turned out that there was a copyright protected, and there was a copyright notice, which means that the copyright holder, the JW300, Jehovah's Witness rather, explicitly prohibited text and data mining. And so even when there was a formal request asked to use that data set, it was denied. The result of this means that the team was stopped from using this data set. So this experience highlights a key issue between where copyright is designed to ideally reward a creator. It's supposed to incentivize creation. However, in this scenario, we found that it unintentionally hindered innovation when the researchers were excluded from using this data set. So here we can see that IP law, or copyright law, can be used both as an enabler, but also we can call it a gatekeeper. So on one hand, it safeguards the creator's rights, which I've talked about, the rights to control the use. But on the other hand, it can restrict access to the data sets essential for public interest research. So in this context, IP laws functions both as the enabler and the gatekeeper, but it can also facilitate innovation when complemented with flexible mechanisms. And we'll talk about this later. What I'm talking about is where we have equitable open licenses, or we have research exceptions for text data mining in our law. So in some research that we had done in the recent past, we looked at what the role of copyright is in the right to research, and especially on the context of text data mining. So in Kenya, as I've said, if you have a copyright, you have the right to control the use of the dataset, but you can have exceptions to this copyright for specific use. This is what is called fair dealing. So you can have fair dealing for research and for scientific research, specifically under the Kenyan law. Does text data mining fall under this? We're not too sure. It may not. It is very ambiguous in the way the law has been set up. So when we don't have this concrete solution in the law, we can either have options like I've talked about, the open licenses. We can have different options. However, when some of us have talked about openness, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, because openness is not a clear outright answer. It has to be, there are nuances to it. So of course, here we're talking about copyright laws, and there's a need for either clear research exceptions or some form of the open data licenses that I've talked about, which is going to be talked about later, and I won't get into that. Ultimately, what I'm talking about is that African IP systems have to either evolve, because there can't be static protection. We have to use dynamic enablers for equitable data governance to come up with equitable African AI tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chebet. And I think following from that discussion and how you have pointed out that IP laws, and more specifically copyright laws, work as both an enabler and a gatekeeper, and how there is need for evolution for the same laws to be clearer. To you, Florence, I'd like to ask whether there are any emerging AI governance frameworks that address issues of data sourcing and use, and how do they address these issues?
Thank you, Cynthia. Borrowing early from the policy conversation that Chebet has just started, I think it goes without saying that we don't have continentally speaking, or rather regionally speaking, we don't yet have a specific AI regulatory framework. Within different nations as well, there's no specific AI regulatory framework. However, what we do have right now, and we're seeing a growth of them, is national AI strategies being developed. We also have the regional AI strategy that exists, that being complemented with, of course, the regional frameworks that speak to data governance and data policy. And then when you come down to the national levels, of course, you have your respective national AI strategies that speak to an element of developing governance structures and governance frameworks for artificial intelligence, as well as now what we call foundational laws, which are your data protection laws, computer misuse, cybersecurity, copyrights, as well as consumer protection and other laws within that respect. So I would say that there is an umbrella of already existing laws that make the foundational base for what AI governance frameworks would look like or would be structured as. But with respect to now looking more specifically into how these foundational frameworks look at data, look at sourcing as well. In looking at them within that context, I would point to the AU AI strategy for starters, because the framework in and of itself emphasizes the importance of developing data policies and strategies that would be able to facilitate responsible access and sharing of non-personal data for AI. Because as it stands, the context within which most people think about data is the context within which people think about data is primarily still within the context of data protection. But data governance in and of itself is a bigger umbrella, and data protection only happens to be a subset of data governance. So within that context, what the AU AI strategy points you to actually is the AU data policy framework, because it looks at the framework in the context of the fact that it establishes data governance frameworks and specific legal protocols that promote ethical, responsible, and secure data sharing, built on particular principles that are also aligned within the framework. And it also includes considerations of things that of elements that look at data localization, look at data classification, as well as cross-border data transfer, as well as now the element of individual privacy, which is handled by the data protection laws. So if you look at now, you come down and now look at what the data policy framework has to offer with respect to that as well, you see that it presents to you certain parameters through which you can be able to sort of feed out how elements of data sourcing can be looked at, how elements of consent can be looked at as well, and how ownership can also be perceived. So the sourcing, consent, those cannot be looked at as a vacuum, so to speak. They're often perceived within the context of data governance framework as well as data governance frameworks as well as data protection laws, more specifically consent within the context of data protection, because that is very clearly outlined as one of the key parameters that would enable you to be able to lawfully collect data within any respect or within any context. Bringing it more to a national perspective, when you look at the Kenya National AI Strategy, it also identifies and notes the fact that data governance is a key component of looking at artificial intelligence, because the basis and the source of looking at AI, of course, feeds from its foundation, that is data. So it looks at elements that also look at informed consent, but informed consent related, again, to data privacy, noting that there are a couple of frameworks that also emphasize the importance of obtaining explicit consent from particular data subjects. Then it also looks at it within the context of data sovereignty as well as ownership, highlighting the need for clear delineated data and ownership rights. So when you look at it within the context of this conversation, I think we perceive consent from the perspective of when it's being collected, from when it's being sourced, and how that consent is actually obtained, and whether or not it's being obtained in a legal manner and with respect to the parameters and laws that have already been set down. So data sourcing is an element that's still being looked at within the pipeline, and Kenya is in the process of coming up with a data governance, a national data governance policy framework that also will look at data sourcing more holistically and the ideal parameters that one would have to consider when we are looking at the collection of data and this is non-personal data, of course, because we already have specific regulations and parameters that look at the collection of personal data. With looking at the data sourcing of non-personal data, I think data classification is also a key element that will be considered within that respect, so that we are able to outline certain parameters that also will be able to create principles and guidelines that relate to how the ownership of that particular data can be perceived, also based on what it will ideally be used for moving forward, and how that can be structured within policy components. So the summary of it is that the current frameworks with respect to artificial intelligence also sort of, with the way they're being structured and with the way they're being built, also pivoting back to looking at what data governance policy frameworks actually say and look like, in terms of looking at what data sourcing is, in terms of looking at what consent looks like.
Thank you, Florence and CIPIT. You two have again just given us a structure of what the legal framework looks like. That that governs and focuses on our AI African data sets. And I'd like to turn and come to you, Dr. Betsy Luridi, and ask you two questions in one. Just one to help us understand the landscape of African data sets. You could tell us what that looks like, and also in terms of availability, quality, and accessibility of the same. And also borrowing from your opening remarks to the very first questions, you could speak to how the lack or limited use of licensing frameworks, as spoken about by CIPIT and Florence, impact how data professionals handle, share, and use data sets.
All right, thanks for that. So what does the current landscape of African data sets look like? We've had a lot of initiatives over the years, whether it's driven globally or locally. Lacuna Fund, for example, stands out because it's funded over 40 projects building data sets for not only African languages, but agriculture, healthcare, and climate resilience. In Kenya, another long-standing initiative that started as a local initiative, can Corpus, that will look at contributing improving data sets for languages. And then individual universities and labs have also been investing in data creation. So I'd say the challenge today is less about availability, but more around sustainability, quality, and accessibility of the data that exists. In terms of sustainability, a lot of our projects around data creation and collection are quite heavily donor-driven or development partner-driven. So they tend to be, or project-driven, so they tend to be short-term. They may lack maintenance beyond the initial funding cycle. And so there's limited long-term hosting and updates with the integration into a public repository. If you look at the different data sets funded by Lacuna Fund, as a start, they are very good, but there's limited building up of those initiatives, and there tends to be a lot of duplication, right? Rather than building, scaling, wide is duplicated efforts. The landscape also differs difference of domain. I'd say the variation is due to the level of investment placed by, again, funders and development partners. So language is very hot right now. So there's a lot of funding being pushed into language data collection. Agriculture and climate is improving, things like to do with remote sensing and all that. Health and biomedical data, still highly restricted due to things like around privacy and governance. Quality, even with language data, in terms of quality, I think Kathleen during COSA talked about the work they're doing around the level of quality for the existing data sets. And so the question is, to what extent are communities involved in validating language data, especially? Do they give a stamp of approval on authenticity and representation before a data set is published? Or even for the published data sets, can we get like a stamp of approval, or have these data sets that are representative and a community feel that, yeah, this is our language and it's accurate to our level? those ones can have a badge of approval for the community, and those ones that are not representative can be downvoted. But quality will always be an issue because if any modeling activity has different aspects. It can be the same data that can be modeled or I won't say manipulated, processed differently to suit different use cases. So as long as the data is accessible, quality issues can just be one of those things that we know 80% of any machine learning or data analyst, 80% of the time is spent cleaning the data. So accessibility and discoverability, I think, is the crux of the matter. I have master's students who want to build, for example, cardiovascular disease detection models, but there's no large cohort imaging or biomedical or hospital records databases that are findable, accessible. We don't have centralized repositories or catalogs for African data sets. So if you look at the big repositories, there's a plethora of data sets for different use cases. So if you know the UCI machine learning repository, even Kaggle, you can find health insurance data, you can find medical imaging, ImageNet, benchmarking Q&A pairs for agriculture, but it's limited to the Western world. So we find people who don't have, like a student who wants to build or upon different models or contextualize them to the African context, it becomes very difficult because these data sets are not findable or accessible. Why is that? There's a lot of institutional gatekeeping. So government, research, and private sector data is siloed and shared. Most of the time is shared informally. You've seen this where you call this person, they'll get you the access of data, rather than, having like a website where you have the process on how to do the data access procedures to be able to request the data. If it requires a monetary exchange, pay for the data and get access to it. So from government agencies to teaching and referral hospitals to universities, a lot of the data is seated in someone's computer, waiting to be liberated, I guess. And then even when legal frameworks exist, and Florence did mention the lack of data governance policies, so a lot of institutions, I feel like they hide behind the Data Protection Act to tell you that, no, I'm not going to give you my data because it's private. So our work, we've been trying to build benchmarking data sets for LLMs, for agricultural, so looking for Q&A pairs. And a lot of the institutions are like, we can't share this out, but it's a question and answer. There's nothing identifiable there. You can anonymize it or you can aggregate it up. So that institutional gatekeeping is one of those challenges, and the lack of clear licensing frameworks around how to share that data for research especially. I know Safaricom does have a statement where they say data can be accessible for research, but how to go about it is left for the person's imagination. And so, yeah, so Data Protection Act misinterpretation, a lot of institutions cite this to withhold data sets. I guess they're just trying to be as cautious as possible, but I know there's research allowance for that data. And then there's unclear usage rights. You give the example of the JW300, just because it's online doesn't mean it's free for use. So a lot of us rely on web scraping, public accessible, assuming that, open just because it's there means you can do whatever you want. And another thing we've been also trying to think about is if we want to build a corpus for code switching from Gengetune, for example, if I buy the CD or if I subscribe to Spotify, it doesn't mean I can download that data and create code switching sharing data set from that. What does that mean for us? So there's around data sharing, there's unclear guidelines on how institutions can share their data for research, what they need to be covered, how do they open up and manage data access requests, how can they monetize this if it means you have to get something back. So those issues need to be outlined for us to be able to get access for research, data for research, basically. Yeah. Thanks. Back to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Dr. Betsy. I think the point on accessibility does come out a bit for as a challenge. And I think to you, Dr. Melissa, that I'd want to ask and bring us back to this conversation of bringing the frameworks that are there and to the challenges that have been pointed out by Dr. Betsy. How can licensing frameworks be designed to balance the need for open data sharing and again advance accessibility in AI research and more keenly African AI research with the equally important goal of preventing negative exploitation and misappropriation of African data sets?
So, in my opinion, I think that licensing frameworks exist. It's just how are they being utilized? For example, I don't want to think that there's data that is out there without a licensing framework, even though I might not be, I might not ascribe to the licensing framework that has been chosen, right? Especially for African data or for personal sensitive data, which we'll get to. So I really want to localize this conversation around language because I think language is one of the biggest sectors or areas where we have an uptake of African data sets being collected. And you find that a majority of those are utilizing open data licenses or open licenses. Sorry for saying data, but that shows you sort of the conversation that there's a push to turn licensing frameworks into open licensing frameworks, which we are originally ascribing to copyright, to these data frameworks. And as much as I do agree with Chebet that yes, we can look at data sets through the copyright lens, the data itself is more complicated than just literary material that has been compiled. It becomes more nuanced when you think about the type of data. Especially, for example, language, which is a cultural heritage or even a cultural expression. If you look at the Protection for Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act, there's a very special way that type of data is meant to be handled, shared, curated, and who is held accountable for it. But in looking at that act, I still see ways of access for people who are within the communities that produce that data. So I think a lot of it has to do with knowledge sharing. Maybe that's not the word. The phrase might be sensitization of how to utilize the frameworks that exist. But for others who utilize open licenses, such as the Creative Commons licenses, then it's a very clear usage and access structure. Now, I think what Dr. Betsy has been talking about is really about what we call government data, right? Government data is a whole other minefield, and access to that is even difficult between government to government agencies, ministries, and organizations, which is something that is becoming more apparent even as we are discussing, for example, the national data governance policy that is being drafted in Kenya. There's a question about access or silos between government entities. Now, once I hear the word research, I sort of relax. Myself as a policy researcher or somebody who advocates for African data sets, I relax because I feel that that is a public interest, and definitely whichever open framework is being utilized would meet the criteria for research. Even if you look at those acts that I've mentioned, or some of those policy frameworks that have been mentioned, they always make an exception for research, allowing people to access them. So maybe we need to ask ourselves, are we letting researchers know how they can access that data using these exceptions, right? And what are sort of the step-by-step actions that they can take? Because it's one thing to tell somebody, well, there's a research exemption in the Copyright Act, and then for that person to know how to utilize that exemption in the Copyright Act to actually get access to data. So yes, there needs to be more sensitization about that. There needs to be more thought about how do we ensure that other than living within a legal regulatory framework, that there's actually an action oriented process that researchers know to utilize to access. At the same time, the second part of your question, for me, when you're talking about preventing exploitation and misappropriation, is a very important part when we are also talking about access to data. A lot of the time, if you remember when we were in school, we used to have board maths. At least when I was in school, we used to have board maths, right? Which allowed you to select what comes first in an equation, right? I don't know what the younger ones are doing now, but there was a way you decided if you had fractions and you were dividing and multiplying and adding at the same time, what you need to do first. So I think we need to think about approaching this in a board maths sort of mindset, right? I would rather ensure that I'm not exploiting than just push for open access. And I know that in many circles, I'm seen as a villain when I say that, but I say that because I understand what happens in communities that are exploited. And the communities are actually in a position where they don't even understand the exploitation that is happening, because we are at the precipice of this emerging technology wave. We're right at the beginning. Even in the West, we don't know the potential of this emerging technology and where it can get them. But we're busy telling communities, give your data, open, share, so that people can research and people can train models, etc. But are we thinking about what is going to happen to this community who have given up all their data? And at this point, I'm not even talking about personal sensitive data, because in the context of language, as I said, that I am contextualizing my answer in, we have communities that have been approached to record voice data as language data, and not just to transcribe text into different African languages. And at the same time, at least in the Kenyan context, we know that people can access their phones, passwords, access M-Pesa accounts using voice activation. Have you informed this community that their voice is out there and can be used and manipulated? Do they understand that? Do they understand the consequences of that? And if in addition to that, we are saying that that data will be open to everybody, all and sundry in the world, what protections have we put for this community? Usually there's no answer to that, because people are rushing to just access the data without thinking about where the data is coming from and what it means for the people. We can start with the individual, that person who has literally lent their voice, or the communities that are helping to transcribe materials so that people can have training data sets in various languages and move us from low resource to high resource. But then we're not asking ourselves, who is the ultimate user? Who's going to be the ultimate user of this? And how have they benefited? And will they benefit? And the same way we've come to ask them to give freely and openly, will they access the tools freely and openly? That's that second part of your question. So what is the balance? I don't know if that is part of your question. What is the balance? And can a licensing framework give a balance? I don't think a licensing framework can give a balance. I think a licensing framework, in conjunction with other frameworks, can then help to bring a balance. Because a licensing framework is very limited in terms of what it's doing. It's talking about access, right? It's talking about access to the data and the use of the data. But it's not going back there to talk about ownership. Let's say, for example, it's assuming ownership already in that licensing framework. It's also assuming that the context of who has given it can fit within the Western ideal of a licensing framework. Okay, we're also talking about personal sensitive data, for example. We need a data governance framework to then step in and work with a licensing framework. Do the two conflict, and how do we merge them? We're also going back into national principles and ideologies when you're talking about cultural preservation, cultural heritage, data sovereignty as well. All these are national principles and ideals. And I've just come from a meeting, Dr. Betsy will tell you, I've come from a meeting this afternoon where I've been saying these things do not work in isolation. And we can't just say this is a conversation for lawyers to come up with the answer. I think we need different different disciplines to step in and say, this is how we can balance this. Okay, lawyers, you're saying that the licensing framework gives access. Great. Ethicists, what are you saying about the ethical guidelines that should be around this? And then linguists, what are you saying about what this means about these words and what meaning the words carry? So that's how we get balance. We can't just expect that the licensing framework will be the answer or the panacea to this problem.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. And again, just
I think we've lost Cynthia again, or is it just me? Okay, while I wait for Cynthia, maybe you can have a backup. Chebet, maybe you can help step in.
Hi, I hope I am not also lost.
No, we
Great.
can hear you.
Okay. I think maybe the next question we can have, or rather, I could also chime in on the same question about licensing frameworks and my take on that. So for me, I think the answer could lie in controlled openness. So we have open data sharing, which is fueled by collaboration, and this can accelerate AI research. But then when we have unrestricted openness, it can also lead to misuse, exploitation, loss of community control. So we need a licensing model that goes beyond a one-size-fits-all approach, which most standard open licenses tend to have that. And they often would release their data into the public domain. And this can be very useful in some certain scenarios or certain projects. But when we're talking about language data, for example, or even data sets that contain traditional knowledge or cultural expressions, which could have also sensitive material, then we have to have a license that is tailored to reflect the community. So that means reflecting what community consent would look like, what the benefit sharing is, because for some communities, an economic benefit or a commercialization aspect to it is important for them. So an equitable benefit sharing or an ethical reuse scenario has to be considered. And possibly it could be structured in a way that balances the recognition of the community, what they've contributed to it, with the protection of the community, ensuring that there's openness which serves the public interest and not just extraction of the data. It could also acknowledge that there's different expectations in different communities. So some communities might want a monetary consideration in it, some do not want, some want access to the AI tools that are generated. So it depends on what the community actually considers as a priority for them. And then also there's need to permit reuse, which you can reserve the rights and of the community, such as attribution and commercial use, but then you need to also permit this use reusing an equitable form. And what I had briefly mentioned before was the Nolite Obodo Open Data License, or the NODL for short, which the video we watched in the beginning explained what this is. It's a tiered licensing framework for data sets, which ensures that there is access to users based on a geographical scenario, such that we have Africans or users who are from developing countries have access, whereas if you're not from those geographical areas, then you need to have some benefit towards the community. And as I said, this benefit could be monetary or non-monetary. I think we have Cynthia who's come back, and so I'll just give it back to her. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chebet. Allow me to have my camera off for now because I'm having internet troubles. But yeah, thank you, Chebet, for progressing with the discussion, and again, apologies for coming in and out. And I wanted to introduce the nodal license, which Mr. Chebet has just spoken on, and maybe also like turn it to Dr. Melissa, who is one of the developers of the license, just to hear from her on what informed the development of the Noodle license. Again, just building from Chebet's comments and also building from your response to your latter question, Dr. Melissa, on how open licenses just can't work alone. They need more. Yeah, please tell us about the Noodle license and how it came about as well.
So Noodle, I always say that Noodle was not something that Professor Chijioke and I decided to do. In fact, we were hounded to create a solution by African AI developers. And this really stems from the conversation that we started having with Masahane. If people remember the video and will also remember what Chebet has mentioned earlier on here this afternoon, there has been a need for African developers to access African languages so that they could train models. You need data sets to train models. And if they're building models for African solutions, then they need sort of local language data sets, because that's how a majority of the African population interacts. So they had a problem with accessing African language data sets. The example of Masahane was that they could access from the Bible, but there was a copyright hurdle there that they could not pursue because they did not have time or resources. Because I think they could have challenged their use, especially for research. They could have challenged that, but you cannot attempt to use it unless you have backing where somebody will say, okay, use it. Let's see if you will be sued for copyright infringement, and then we'll back you up in a legal battle to sort of establish that it is for a research purpose and that text data mining actually fits within the ambit of research, right? They didn't have resources to do that. So they abandoned the data set, and they then decided to collect their own language data. And in order for them to collect language data, they went to the communities. So they went to communities and started to record them and ask them to transcribe, etc. And it was not just Masahane. There are many other African AI developers who go to communities to collect data. And sometimes it's just purely language data. Sometimes it's language data that also comes with specific knowledge. For example, I do know people who collect knowledge about agricultural practices, also about practices to deal with climate change, etc., but predominantly in African languages. So for me, what happened is I went to talk to AI developers about what open licenses are. I was specifically discussing the Creative Commons suite of licenses. And when I finished explaining that essentially, if you use the Creative Commons 0 license or the CC 0 license, you are actually putting your work firmly into the public domain. The developer said, but wait, if we've collected this data and now you're saying we've put it in the public domain, other people can utilize this data set and create tools faster than us because they have more resources than us. They have more compute power, they have data centers, etc. And so they can move faster. What does that mean for them and the communities that they've collected the data from? And I said, well, tough. You select a Creative Commons 0 license, then you are essentially collecting and putting it to the public domain for anybody to use for commercial, non-commercial services they don't even have to attribute to. And so the next question was, what is the alternative? And we did not have an alternative. And so they tasked us with finding an alternative license that they could utilize. Now, why did it take the form of a license? It's because that is what they had to present to those who are funding them as an alternative to the CC0 license. They had to come up with something that was similar, that wasn't too drastic or radical away from what they were already utilizing. And Professor Chijioke and I sat down and really thought about centering the community, because for us, language would not exist in the African continent without communities that speak, preserve, and have curated them. Especially if you think about the history of language. Just decades ago, a few decades ago, Africans were not allowed to speak their languages in schools, in workplaces, even in places of worship, such as depending on where you were geographically in Africa, they were not allowed to use that because of colonization and other inherent political power plays or geopolitical power plays that were happening. So the fact that we're in 2025 and Africans are still speaking their local languages or indigenous languages, as they like to be referred to, it is an effort that has been made to preserve and curate. So what can we do for that community, or how are we ensuring that that community is getting a benefit for doing this curation preservation that is now offering them access to the African AI ecosystem, because people need access to that language in order to train models. And a lot of people will say, oh, but it only makes sense for African communities and African populations because they're the ones who speak the language anyway. But if you look at the statistics of who is downloading the data sets that are already out there under CC0 license, you'll find that there are big tech companies who are downloading. They are very quick to download new data sets that are uploaded in African languages, which tells me that there is interest other than from the African AI ecosystem. So that's how we came up with Noodle. We came up with Noodle to center the community, and we defined the community in two ways. There's the language community, meaning the community that curated, preserved, spoke the language, and gave up their voices literally or helped in translation. And we also have the data community because we recognize that there's an effort that's put into translating this work into machine readable data. So there are two communities, the data community and the language community. And both these communities need to be able to at least have a say about who can access this data set that they have created. And essentially that's why Noodle came into play. Noodle has faced a lot of resistance, and I'm not surprised about that. There's a lot of resistance because people do not understand the tiered system for access to the data set. And it's tiered because in the name Noodle is open data as well. We want to ensure that people from the communities where the languages are spoken can access that data set for free. We want to ensure that they will be the ones who build and train models utilizing those data sets. So there is an open element. It doesn't mean that everybody will pay for it. No. Because it's based on geographical area, it's also based, you can argue that it's also based on use, because depending on geographical area, your use also might change. Those who are not or farther away from that community will end up paying for it. And farther away is not just geographical, it also means people who are from developed countries. So if you are from an area that is defined as a developed country and you want to utilize that and you're utilizing it within that developed country, then you need to have a conversation with the community. We did not want to prescribe to the community what type of benefit that they should get, because we felt that that would be ourselves imposing again on the community rather than listening and having the community express what it is that they want. We've left that element open for the community to decide, but also allowing for negotiation so that if it's somebody from the developed world but is conducting something to do with research, they can speak to the community, explain to the community what the benefit they would receive from them accessing that data set would be, and that community can then make a decision on a case-by-case basis. The resistance has been, oh, we can't go and speak to we can't always go and talk to the community. Or this is going to be time-consuming. It's going to be expensive for us to talk to the community. And essentially, these are people who, when you ask them, okay, if you don't want to talk to the community, but you want to access the data set, what do you want to do with the data set? They explain that they want the data set to assist people somewhere else to train their models. And training the model is not for research purposes. It's actually for commercial purposes. So that really is the tough conversations that we are currently having around Noodle. But I also want to say that Noodle is not the only alternative license that has come up in the last 2 years, because these have come up in the last 2 years. Noodle inspired the Lapa AI, which is the commercial offshoot of the Masahani Research Collective, to come up with the Issuer 2 license. And essentially, the main difference between Noodle and Issuer 2 is that Issuer 2 really ensures that it's only Africans who can access that data set for free. They did not want to include other developing countries the way Noodle has done. They wanted it to be purely an African license. So that's the difference between the Issuer 2 license and the Noodle license. There's also some form of tiered license. They don't really call it a license, they call it membership, from Niger Voices in Nigeria, which covers Western Africa. And they've said that you would pay a membership fee, and the membership fee would give you access to the different data sets. So depending on what tier of membership you are in, then you get more access or restricted access and user rights to the data sets. All these are just answering the question that the AI developer community had of what is the alternative to the Creative Commons suite of licenses. Another thing I want to point out is I am definitely not against the Creative Commons suite of licenses. I sit on the Creative Commons board currently, and I believe that they definitely have a role to play within the copyright framework. However, utilizing them on African data sets really does not end up with the result that enshrines the principles around why the Creative Commons licenses were used. And the very first principle is voluntary choice, meaning you as the owner of the copyright material make a voluntary choice to utilize the Creative Commons license. Nobody is holding a gun to your head and telling you you must use that license. In the context of African language datasets, the African language AI developers and the African language community are not offered a choice. They are held by the throat or to account through a funder agreement or a grant agreement, which is essentially a contract. So if you receive funding, then you must apply a particular type of Creative Commons license. That does not follow really the whole idea of openness. Openness should be a choice, a voluntary choice that you make because you believe and are prescribing to the values and principles of openness. It should not be something that somebody else prescribes to you who has not taken into account the historical value and relevance of a particular data set, because these are not just words, like we can say English is just words. In the African context, there's rich culture and history around it, and even the survival of those languages has a deep, deep meaning. So tell me if I'm going off script or if I'm answering your question. So that's how we ended up with Noodle. That's why it's a tiered license. Tiered means it's open for some and it is then not open to others. But we, as the creators of the license, do not make the decision. It is the community that makes the decision. So the Noodle license actually prompts people who want to use a data set to reach out to the community and have a conversation with them about what it is that they want to do. The feedback so far is, oh, it'll take time, we don't have time, oh, it's expensive, oh, we don't want to. Essentially, they're saying it's an inconvenience for them because they are used to just having a free for all access. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for that contribution. And again, just goes to show that it's not that there are no solutions, is the use of it as well. And also looking at the time, and also seeing that we have three questions in our Q&A, and also for the attendees who are here and have a question, you can drop the same in the Q&A section, this webinar. I had wanted us to go into a conversation on whether, because the node license is a positive solution to African language datasets access and use. I want us to look at whether we can, or rather how that same model, how it can be expanded to potentially extend to other African datasets, like health and agriculture, as pointed out by Dr. Betsy in her response. But because of time, maybe we should organize another webinar to have that conversation. I'd like to ask one final question to all our panelists today. In view of all the discussions and everything that we have said, in one sentence or two, what is the single most important step Africa should take in order to, again, protect and leverage datasets within the AI era? And again, this is taking into account the discussions we've had, and then we can go into the Q&A. I'll start with you, Dr. Betsy.
Yeah, in one sentence, what Africa should come again with the question?
In a sentence, yes.
Yes.
In one sentence, the single most important step Africa should take to protect and leverage its datasets. Yes.
We should move away from, I guess, data access models to actually having, stipulated and clear guidelines around how to request access, how to use that data, but also including the data contributors, so the community from whom you are accessing the data from. So they also need to understand how this data is being used, for what purposes, beyond the current use and beyond, and also have the opportunity to opt out. So if you're going to use my data from beyond what it was collected for, I have the opportunity to opt. I need to be given the opportunity to opt out. So I think we can lead those discussions because it's a frontier sort of development around data governance.
Thank you, Dr. Betsy. Florence?
I will attempt to keep it to a sentence. I hope I'm able to keep it to a sentence, but from my end, I think the most important step that can be taken collectively by the continent is to consider from both policy perspective and a technical perspective the realities of who is benefiting from the use of the technologies that are being built using African datasets. If we have the proper infrastructure to be able to further enable them to have access and to further consider how ownership and benefit sharing can look like, especially in terms of protecting African datasets. That's what I say.
Thank you, Florence. Chebet?
So for me, I think African governance, and this includes IP and specific to this conversation, copyright systems, have to evolve from the static overprotection kind of model to one that is more dynamic, that enables equitable data governance, data access, and this in turn will help with AI development that is suitable and considers the nuances within the African context. Thank you.
Thank you, Chebet. Dr. Melissa?
Africa needs to do an inventory in terms of the data assets that it has. And in doing that inventory, it needs to understand the value of the data assets that it has, so that all these other things will flow. I think right now there's a lack of understanding of the value in African data sets. Other people can see the value in that, which is why they're pushing to have more access to that. And we don't understand the value or even understand what would be a data asset. And that's why we are willing to allow people to tell us what to prescribe as to access, ownership, and control. So we really need to first sit down and do a data asset inventory and understand the value of that in order for us to move forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists today. Before we completely wrap it up, we do have some questions, 3 questions. I believe we can take them and then wrap up our webinar today. So question 1 is from Reese M. It says, so how are projects like Grok, X learning African languages, and are they just learning from X content? And how have they learned so fast? I want to put it open to any of our panelists to answer this question. I could also direct it at someone. Any of our panelists? Yes, Dr. Betsy.
Yeah, I mean, we have to think about how large language models operate. Essentially, they are probabilistic models. So given a word, it makes a best guess on what the next word should be. And so when you see Grok replying, it doesn't necessarily understand what it's saying. It's just given the data that it's been trained on. If you say X, I will say Y, right? And so it's not about it being able to learn African languages, at least. So yes, it's been training on whatever open data sets are there in terms of sentence construction, next word generation. Definitely it's learning from X content, whether or not you are approved for it to learn from your content. I don't know if there's an opt-out. But yeah, so that's how, so even if it replies and you're amazed at how well it speaks Sheng, remember that large language are probabilistic, so it's just guessing based on the corpora of knowledge, what's the next best word. So it's not necessarily that it understands what the conversation flow is, but it's making a best guess of what the next word should be to form a coherent sentence. And so it's not necessarily learning the way you'd conceptualize learning an African language is versus coming and giving the best possible next answer. So I think that when you say learning, it's different from spitting out words. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered the question.
I believe you have. The second question is from an anonymous attendee. It asks, if an African dataset is hosted on AWS or Google Cloud, does the license still meaningfully guarantee African control?
I can take that. So whenever you use any of these proprietary tools, they already come with their own terms and conditions of use. So if you look at AWS or Google Cloud, they already determine for you the relationship and the use. So somebody the other day was saying, I don't know if you've heard about Spotify, but somebody was saying, oh, did you know that Spotify is now has a perpetual non-exclusive license, worldwide license over your work? And my thought was Spotify has done that since at least, because that's when I had a podcast, at least in 2021, 2022. It said that if you uploaded anything on there, then you were giving them access, or you were licensing it to them under those terms. So if you're hosting an African data set on AWS or Google, you have to look at what the terms and conditions from these companies are saying before you actually put the data there. So yes, you must read those very long, very boring licenses or terms and conditions, because you are already, when you click to agree, you are already prescribing to what they want you to prescribe to. So does that meaningfully guarantee African control? I guess we'd have to dissect those licenses, and I do not want to do that here. We do not have the time. But just note that you do not set the parameters, that platform sets the parameters for you. And if there are platforms that are not developed by Africans or are not developed in the interest of Africans, then it would be highly unlikely that they would meaningfully guarantee African control.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. And to our last question from Joseph Mune. Given that Africa is predominantly a visual continent and that most African languages from Kiswahili to Gikuyu use the English alphabet rather than indigenous scripts like Ethiopia's, how can this linguistic and visual uniqueness be leveraged as an advantage? That's the first part. And from a strategic or how perspective, could Africa's diverse languages and visual culture serve as tools for secure or coded communication, similar to how Native American languages were used during World War II? And how does this connect to unlearning the misconception of Africa's size and recognizing its true global significance? The 3 questions here. Gilberto, Florence, or anyone can jump in and answer.
Maybe let me jump in, and I'm going to probably frame this from a Kenyan context. If you look at the Protection of Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act, it doesn't really specifically say language. It talks about words, it talks about symbols, etc., that are protected, right? And defines them as traditional knowledge and others as cultural expression. So I think that there are already frameworks that are understanding the value of these unique forms of expression or communication. I cannot speak to the how they can serve for secure or coded communication. And maybe this is my bias, especially around having conversations with government in policy formulation conversations. And those who come from the security or intelligence field are very reluctant to expose what exactly it is that they're utilizing. So I think that already might already be happening, but if it is happening, it would defeat the purpose of having a public conversation of how that could be utilized. I think that you might find that's already utilized. If we just take Kiswahili, for example, I do know in Uganda and Rwanda, Kiswahili was used as the language for the military because very few people would understand, and would also help their allies to understand what it is that they were saying. So I think the how is already happening if you're talking about to serve as tools for secure coded communication. In the public sense, I don't know what data analysts would say or AI developers who code algorithms would say about utilizing that. But I do think the opportunity is there. The questions might be around resources to enable that in happening. Unlearning the misconception of Africa's size and recognizing its true global significance, I think, is what I've just been saying about taking an inventory. I think it's about time that we took stock of what it is that we have and stop looking outwards for value. We look back inwards and recognize this for value. And for me, the best example would be what happened during last year's protests, where we had the youth really taking up the financial bill and translating it into their various local languages in order to get buy-in from different generations. And really, that had a huge impact on the social media platforms in pushing them to really think about how they could translate or find ways to transcribe what was happening. I think there was a big push from that. That is my personal opinion. I do not want to put anybody on the line to prove that as being true. But yes, we do need to take inventory, take stock of what it is that we have and recognize that it is valuable, instead of thinking that it will only be valuable when it has been utilized and transformed into a tool or product by somebody from somewhere else who doesn't really understand the context of this thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. And there's one last question that came in on how do we prevent ethics washing, where firms claim African partnership by citing the license, but never actually return tangible value.
Is this referring to the Noodle license? I'm not quite sure.
We can contextualize it there because they're also not specific.
Let me only speak for the Noodle license because that's what I can speak for. I think that the Noodle license is utilized. It will have to be utilized by the African partner, and not by the quote unquote farm, right? Because that license is utilized by the owner of the data set, and the Noodle license has firmly said that the owner of the data set is the community. So it will be the community to use the license or to cite the license, right? If somebody from somewhere else cites that license, they have to prove their connection to the community. And thank goodness for the Protection of Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act, especially in the Kenyan context, because that defines the community and defines sort of the user agreements that would have to be put in place in order for somebody else to claim ownership of cultural assets or expressions, including words, which essentially then form words and symbols, which essentially then form part of a language. So for me, where I see the ethics washing, or what I call the open washing happening, is for licenses such as the Creative Commons license that that anybody anywhere can use and doesn't have to have a discussion with anyone else. Then you can just place the label and move on with life. But for the Noodle license, community must be involved, and a conversation with community must be involved, and a community representative must be named as somebody to have a negotiation with. So I think that would be difficult to do. And if it is done, I would really be interested to see how they pulled it off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we come to the end of our webinar today. Again, a great thanks to our panelists for the insights shared and for making this discussion what it was. Dr. Melissa Omino, thank you so much. Dr. Betsy, who had to drop off due to another engagement at 5:30. We're grateful, Mr. Bet, and Ms. Florence as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. At this point, I'd also like to invite us for our final webinar in this CIPIT AI webinar AI governance series, which will be happening on November 20th, 2025. You can scan the QR code to register for the same, and also keep an eye out on our socials for the registration link. My key takeaway is that we have solutions, it's how we go about them. And with that, thank you so much, and have a lovely, lovely evening. Asante sana.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.